Hey guys, it's Melissa Moore. Thanks for joining me on today's episode of Faith, Hope, Love, where we grow together in our faith, increase in hope, and learn how to better love God and love other people. On today's episode, we are in our What's Your Type Enneagram series, and today we are joined by a Type 6, Tara Beth Leach. So thank you, Tara, for joining me on the show today. If you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, as well as answering our obvious question, what's your type?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here. Love talking Enneagram and the incredible growth journey that God has taken me on. And so, I am an Enneagram 6, which is often called the loyalist.
How long have you been studying the Enneagram? And when you first started, did you originally type as a Type 6? Did you mistype? What was your journey with all that?
Yeah, so the very first time I was briefly introduced to the Enneagram was when I was going through the ordination process years ago. Part of the ordination requirements is that we would attend something called the Midwest Ministry Center for Health. And so, we went through all of the psychological testing. And we also did spiritual gifts, and Enneagram happened to be one of those. And I sat with a counselor all day. And I remember staring at this giant whiteboard where he had put two different types up there. And one was a helper and one was a loyalist. And I had not, and again, this was just the test, a written test. And so there was no self-reflection. And this counselor sat with me for maybe 15 minutes and said, I'm going to read two descriptions, and which one sounds more like you? And at the time, and when he read me those descriptions, that time of my life, helper sounded right because I happened to be in positions where I was helping a lot of people. I was a teaching assistant in my seminary for Scott McKnight. I was an associate pastor. I was a mom of littles. I was a part of a bunch of different moms groups. And so two just sounded right. But again, there was no self-reflection. So it really wasn't until probably 6 or 7 years ago that I started to take a real deep dive. I started to read Richard Rohr. I started to read The Road Back to You. That was a little later. And started just meeting other people that were interested in the Enneagram. And we would talk about it obsessively, as one does when you first kind of get into the Enneagram. You just are so excited about it and you kind of start geeking out about it. And I did that. And it just became so crystal clear to me that I was an Enneagram 6. And I fought it though, because helper just sounded so much more wonderful. I want to, I am a helping type. I am like, I love, I consider myself to be a nurturing person. I am a pastor, and I view pastoring through the lens of being a mom in a lot of ways. It's very maternal for me. And this idea of being a loyalist who is marked by fear, I didn't want that. I was mortified. And I remember someone said to me, they said, if you are reading an Enneagram type and you are repulsed by it, it's quite possible that that is your type. And that was indeed the case for me. And so I have been on this journey of, I don't know, roughly 6 years of deep self-reflection and work and integrating what it means to be an Enneagram 6 and growing towards wholeness.
I love that. And I think that's something that I've heard a lot of people say, like, oh, I just took a test and like that's my number. And I'm like, but you have to dig deeper. And it's funny, I'm a Type 3. I mistyped as a Type 2 for a long time, kind of with similar things, being involved in ministry and being a mom. Like, you take on these roles where like you just serve people. And it's almost like encouraged in the church, I think, as women to be a 2, because it's like, that is like the ideal woman almost, which is unfortunate, because I think you can see women across biblical literature that like there's so many women for each of the types. So I appreciate you kind of talking about that, the 6 versus the 2.
Yeah, and I think that women are often mistyped as 2s. because we are formed in a lot of ways. Culture forms us, our families form us, churches form us to be helpers. Often the ones that are maybe more behind the scenes and not up front, and which is a really unfortunate. And don't get me wrong, like helpers. I mean, my best friend in the whole world is a number two, and she's a senior vice president for the nation's largest hospital system. So it's not just a behind the scenes person, but it just, yeah, it's just amazing how I think women are often mistyped as twos.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'm hoping as women are watching this, and maybe some men too, that they'll maybe kind of be able to question, like, maybe I don't have the correct number, quite the right number. I like that you had said if it makes you a little upset, maybe that's your number. That was the case for me. I'm like, I didn't want to be a three because I'm like, it's so much more comfortable to be a two. But man, like once I really embraced it, man, I could really enjoy the benefits of my type.
Yeah, you got to embrace it. And like I said, my best friend who's a two, like she hates that she's a two. She's just repulsed by all the dark sides. And so we're just all like that with our numbers.
I love it. So I really would just love to dive into type six. Obviously, if people have watched previous episodes, we've talked about each type has strengths and weaknesses, directions of stress and growth. And so for a type six, what has been your personal experience in each of those areas, specifically before COVID, as well as the season of life that we are in right now?
Yeah. So, a type six is one that longs for security. Our basic need, our basic longing, our basic desire, motivation is to have a sense of security. And so for me, that plays out in looking for, like, okay, where are my guardrails? Where are my safety nets? Where are there potential hazards? And so that shows up for me in I really love order. And so, whereas an achiever might like order in a clean house because it looks good, for me, it brings about like predictability and security. And I love like organized spaces, which is a very different motivation for a one. Like a one like wants organized spaces for different reasons than a six. And again, for me, it's all about that predictability, about structure. There's a sense of knowing, like, okay, this is what I know what to expect, and this is safe and this is secure. But we're also known for loyalty. Loyalty on one end, but also like the distrust. And so usually, if I meet someone in authority, I kind of think at my first impression of them as that they're full of malarkey until I, until after, sitting at their feet for a while or being around them, they have to prove to me that they are worth listening to and worth following. And I often think about this as a pastor, because they say that sixes are the most common type in the world. It's the most common type. And so I often think about this as a pastor. How many people walk into church on a Sunday morning, hear me preach, and that are sixes, and they probably, if it's the first time they've ever heard me preach, they're going to think I'm full of malarkey until like the first four times. And then after that, but then after that, like if you can earn a six's loyalty, they are the ride or die friend. We are there for life, and we're protective, and we are for you.
I think it's beautiful that you mentioned that as a pastor, as a six, you kind of already, you can read the people in the room. You're understanding what, if there's sixes that are in your church, what they're wanting from a pastor, the things that they may be worried about. And I think that's really cool that you're able to bring your type into your leadership. So I think that's really cool. With that, have you seen some of your like weaknesses coming out within this season of COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of my weaknesses during the season of COVID is just a overwhelming feeling that I just need to do more, um, be more productive. And so again, like this sense of achieving that sixes struggle with, like, yeah, for sure. Like we go into three and on health, and a lot, and we take on the tendencies of a three. And so, when COVID first began, especially, I was tilting towards the workaholism scale pretty heavily. But a lot of that is even just not even out of a need to achieve, it's out of a need to prove my loyalty to the organization that I'm working for. And so, during COVID and times of stress, it's like I want everyone to know, like, look at me, I'm working hard. Don't you see I'm loyal? Don't you see I'm faithful? Like, don't you see that I'm committed? Don't you see that, like, I'm good at what I do? When it came to the actual stress of like the pandemic, like sixes were ready for this pandemic, like the day we were born. So what's so unique about sixes is the fear that we often experience is anticipatory, not like when we're in it. Like when we're in a scenario or a situation that is scary or stressful, we come alive. Like we're ready for it. We're like here for it. I was prepared for this. Like I've got my emergency backpack and I've got my list of all the things that we're going to do. So like when we're in the moment, like we're on fire. It's anticipating. So for example, in January of 2020, I was pastoring in Southern California and I read an article about COVID-19 coming to America. And the article said that it is going to be very disruptive to the American life. And at first I was skeptical, but then I was like, oh my goodness. And I was so stressed out, like anticipating what was going to happen. But then when it came, I was like a warrior, like leading our church through this. Like I knew exactly what to do. I was ready. And so, sixes are so interesting when it comes to like major life events. When it happens, we kind of go on overdrive.
I think that's actually really cool that you mentioned that, because from what I observed, obviously I'm not like I'm not an expert in this, but like looking at different churches and how they responded, it was more like reaction. Like they were not really prepared and they didn't really know what was going on. None of us really knew fully what was going on. But I think for you to come into it I didn't hear about it until March, but for you to have heard about it and been kind of processing it since January, that gave you a leg up on it almost, and gave your church kind of this ability to really respond rather than react.
And I wrote about it in the Enneagram Reflection series. We were one of the first large churches in Southern California to make the decision that we were not going to be opening our doors for in-person worship on that Sunday. And by that Friday, by the time like we had reached that Friday before that first Sunday when churches started shifting their worship patterns, we had already had like a 6-page Excel document on all of like the levers and the things that would have to happen for us to do this and do this and do this. And, we had 6 guiding principles and how we were going to make decisions through COVID. And it was like, I was made for this.
For you, obviously, you didn't have a book of yours to read. What are some tools that really helped you to grow in health and wholeness as a type 6?
Yeah. So therapy has been a means of grace for me for a while now. I love my therapist. She is a gift for me. She is a woman of God, a Christian therapist. She's been a pastor before, and she teaches psychology at Fuller Seminary. And so that weekly rhythm and practice of kind of, I don't want to say forced reflection. I mean, unforced reflection, yet like I guess maybe is what I'm trying to say is structured reflection. And that digging deep, and to be able to sit with someone week after week that knows me so well, perhaps even at times better than I know myself, is so helpful, especially for an Enneagram 6, because sixes we're in the dependent posture. And so we're always kind of dependent on others to help guide us oftentimes. And so to have another person guide us through the journey of self-reflection, but also surrounding ourselves with other people, leaders of faith, has been a helpful practice for me. And then one of the scariest practices for a 6 is getting alone and getting alone to our own thoughts. Because again, like we're in the dependent posture, like we want to process our thoughts with our closest and most trusted people. And so a practice that I started taking on was just going out, and I live in the woods, And you can see behind me, those of you watching on video, that's the woods back there. And so I would go hiking in the woods alone in silence, to my own thoughts, to me and God. And one of the things that did for me is, sixes, we're in the headspace, like we're just so caught up like in our own mind and our own thoughts. And what that did is walking alone in the woods in silence activated my mind with my body and the movement. And I was able to order my thoughts and learn how to listen to my gut, which is a struggle for sixes, and learn how to listen to my gut there alone in the silence. And so it's a really scary practice for a six to get alone and do that, but such an important one for growth.
I think you've mentioned some really key ones and ones that I resonate with a lot as well as a three, with making sure that you have consistent time where you are in therapy. I'm any type, really, whatever type you are watching this, like take time, find a therapist that's going to fit your needs, and do that. I appreciate you saying that it was a grace to you. I've had the same experience. I would not be where I am today without years of therapy. And then with having trusted individuals and getting alone, same for myself as a three. Like if I didn't have those three things, I would not be who I am today. So I really, obviously our podcast, the show is called Faith, Hope, Love. And I just feel like those are so fundamental as Christians to really embody that in our world. And so for you as a type six, what does it look like for you to live in faith, hope, and love?
So as a six, this pressure to prove ourselves is very real. To prove that we are loyal, to prove that we are strong, to prove that we are courageous, to prove that we are not afraid. And what God actually calls us to is not to prove, but to simply be, because it's already been done. It's already been finished. The work has been finished. And so what God calls us to then in response is not to prove, but is to ordinary, everyday faithfulness. And so for me, as a follower of Jesus, this ordinary faithfulness is the things that are more hidden, that I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone, but simply being. And so it's the simple practice of waking up every morning at 4:45 a.m. And for me, that's such a cherished and important practice of waking up every morning at 4:45 a.m. in prayer and abiding and being in the presence of God and reading scripture, and then engaging my body by going to the gym, and then engaging in Christian fellowship, just the very simple, ordinary things, engaging in Christian fellowship and worship on the Sunday morning gathering, and also within group life. Engaging in loving my first neighbors, my family, my husband, and my children. It's those ordinary things of living it out in the home, of living it out in the church, and living it out in my actual body is how I practice ordinary faithfulness of faith, hope, and love.
I love that. And that's a beautiful answer. I feel like that could go for all of the types, really just to be able to like the starting your day. And I think maybe even more so as a six, I would guess, having that level of anxiety always there, to be able to begin your day in a state of peace and rest, I feel like would be so transformative. And I'm sure that's something I'm trying to implement as well, starting my day in a state of worship rather than having my eyes on myself and my own things, putting my eyes on God. I feel like that's so beautiful that you start your day in that way. That's very early for me, but I think that is so powerful, and I think would be a big blessing to any of the types.
I was never, if you would have known me in college, like you would have laughed, like if you would have heard that I wake up so early. And it's this crazy thing, like it's, a book that transformed my life called The Miracle Morning. Cannot recommend it enough. It is not a book from a Christian perspective, but any Christian can read it and take those practices and apply it to reading scripture and prayer. But it's completely transformed my life. And it's for a six. And I think, there's different reasons why it would be helpful for different Enneagram numbers, but for a six to be able to start the morning and centering myself in the presence of God, as you said, just it levels anxiety for me. And I can tell a difference on the days that I do it and I don't do it.
Obviously, you didn't have your book to read as you were processing through your Enneagram journey, but for those that are sixes, you've provided this really amazing resource and opportunity for reflection daily. Would you explain a little bit about what your book does and how it would benefit the type 6 reader?
Yeah, so the book is called 40 Days of Being a Six, where it is essentially 40 journal entries. And I happen to have written the book in a pandemic. I wrote the book while I was moving from California back to Chicagoland, and while my dad was in the dying process. And so it was a really raw and vulnerable work for me. Um, and so it's daily just experiences and journal entries. Like if you want to know what it's like to be a six, and then there is daily application, either a prayer practice or Bible reflection, or something that one could do to grow in their journey, or sometimes even just reflection questions. So it's a really simple little book, very different from the normal things that I might write, but it was a fun project nonetheless.
And I think that's really important, I think, for all the types to have a book that's very simple, short, quick, daily reflections. That would be a good way if you're going to start a morning practice to incorporate that for 40 days. And I feel like that's a good way to kind of start a habit. So I just appreciate you putting that book out, and obviously your whole team that has done that. It's they're really, really, really well done. So if you're six, pick it up. If you know a six, pick it up. What are some final tips that you would give to either a type 6 or someone that loves a type 6?
So, just a tip for a type 6 is show up for yourself and for God, for Jesus. We are so busy showing up for others to prove our loyalty, and so deeply afraid of being alone and going at it alone, that we don't always do a good job of just being present for ourselves in the presence of God. It seems scary to do such a thing, because we're so dependent on others, but that is a gift. And if you know someone that is a six, affirm them. To journey into those spaces of silence and rest and solitude in the presence of God, and even self care is so important. Um, and if you are close with an Enneagram 6, just know that you have a friend for life. And if you are just meeting an Enneagram 6, just know it's going to take time.
Two of my best friends are sixes, and I have to constantly remind myself, you have to be consistent and loving them and reaching out, because it blows my mind. The sixes that I know are so invested in all their relationships, but they don't always receive that back in return. And what a sadness that is, to me, that would happen. But I really encourage you, if you are someone watching this that you are a six, I pray that you would know your worth, and know that that God sees you and He will always be loyal to you. And if you're watching this and you're not a six, I totally agree. We need to be loyal to those that we love, and being intentional in those relationships. So I so appreciate your time. Before we close out, how can we continue following you? Maybe list some of your other books that you have out.
Yeah, so you could check out, I wrote a Bible study on the Sermon on the Mount called Kingdom Culture, and then a book called Emboldened, A Vision for Empowering Women in Ministry, and then a book called Radiant Church that came out this year. So yeah, and you can find me on social media. I'm on Twitter, Tara Beth Leach, Instagram, and Facebook.
I love it. And Radiant Church is on my to read list. I just purchased it, so it's on there. And I really do feel like you've put out so much amazing work into the world. And I think really encouraging authenticity, and the church showing up in a way that is going to actually love the people in our communities. And obviously, as a six, you embody that in your day-to-day life in the way that you are loyal to not just your family and your friends, but also to your church community. So thank you so much just for your time and hopping on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
Well, everyone that's watching this, I hope this was an encouraging time for you, whether you are a type 6 or you love a 6. I will see you back here next week.